Welcome, everyone. My name is Joseph Campana. I'm a professor of English, and I am the director of the Center for Environmental Studies and the co-director of the Environmental Studies minor. And I'm pleased to welcome you tonight to the latest episode of Planet Now, Conversations in Environmental Studies. Our webinars emphasize a habit of conversation across disciplines and across communities about important questions facing us right now. Our events are always free and open to the public. Whenever possible, we record these conversations and make them available online, also for free. And you can find previous episodes at enst.rice.edu/event-videos. And you'll find that in the chat in just a moment. And I'll also say quickly, we've just gotten up the videos for our last two episodes in Planet Now from a couple weeks ago, a wonderful hybrid event, kind of part in-person, part virtual, with Matthew Tejada, Director of Environmental Justice for the EPA. And we've also just posted our first episode of a new initiative in Planet Now, Planet Herido, an episode in Spanish, an interview between my colleague Gisela Jefes and the novelist Samantha Schweblin, author of Fever Dreams. I've been looking forward to tonight's webinar for some time, Remaking Nature, Geo Engineered Worlds. And I'm thrilled to be in conversation with Holly Jean Buck, Christopher Preston, and Luis A. Campos, as well as my colleague, Elizabeth Petrick. I'll introduce our guests in a moment, after which each will speak for about 10 minutes. From there, we'll launch into conversation. So please remember, you can post questions at any time in the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. First, a few acknowledgements. Rice University is located in the sprawling city of Houston on the Gulf Coast of Texas, and we acknowledge we live on the ancestral lands of the Karankawa, the Sana, the Coatlicán, and the Atacapa Ixac. I want to also make some internal institutional acknowledgements. The Center for Environmental Studies is located in the Schools of Humanities and Architecture, and I'm grateful for the support of Deans Kathleen Canning and Igor Marjanovic. I also want to give a shout out to the co-organizer and co-parent of the Planet Now series, who is also the co-director of the Environmental Studies curriculum, Richard Johnson, Rice's executive director for sustainability, and he also directs the Administrative Center for Sustainability and Energy Management. Richard has taught over 25 classes at Rice. He has been with the ENST curriculum since it began. Therefore, he always has the answers I don't have about it. And he's back this coming spring, in a course called Sustainable Futures, co-taught with NASA engineer Larry Tops. I also want to give a shout out tonight to a new initiative. We're connecting with Classroom Connect. I want to thank Kate Cully from the Alumni Relations Office. So a set of alums are listening in now, and they'll be having a conversation afterward with my excellent colleagues, Richard Johnson, who I just mentioned, and Professor Carrie Masiello, Director of the Carbon Hub and Professor of Earth and Environmental and Planetary Sciences. Finally, I just want to thank the humanities team that makes these events possible. Andrew Steffel, John Waterhouse, Paula Platt, Eric Granquist, and project manager for the Mellon Foundation, Diluvial Houston Grant, Weston Twardowski. I'm also delighted tonight to be joined by my colleague, Elizabeth Petrick, Associate Professor of History at Rice. Professor Petrick studies the history of computer technology, information technologies, civil rights, and public policy, and the relationship between the development and use of technology, and is also the author of Making Computers Accessible, Disability Rights and Digital Technology, winner of the 2017 Computer History Museum Book Prize. Professor Petrick, I also want to mention, is the driving force behind an emerging program in science and technology studies here at Rice, so stay tuned for that, and we're looking forward to more collaborations to come. Now, I'm especially keen to welcome our three distinguished guests. Holly Jean Buck is Assistant Professor of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Buffalo, and author of the already influential After Geoengineering, Climate Tragedy, Repair, and Restoration, and co-editor of Has It Come to This? The Promises and Perils of Geoengineering on the Brink, and author of, I had my notes forthcoming, but the just out, Ending Fossil Fuels, Why Net Zero is Not Enough. Welcome to Professor Buck. Christopher Preston, Professor of Philosophy at the University of Montana, though tonight he is tuning in at 2 a.m. from Finland, and we're grateful for that. Professor of Philosophy at the University of Montana, and the author of Grounding Knowledge, Environmental Philosophy, Epistemology, and Place, and also the award-winning and much translated The Synthetic Age, Out-Designing Evolution, Resurrecting Species, and Re-Engineering Our World. World, as well as the editor of Climate Justice and Geoengineering, Ethics and Policy in the Atmospheric Anthropocene. Finally, my about-to-be new colleague, Luis A. Campos. I guess since you're here, you're already my colleague, but Luis A. Campos, who will be joining Rice in January as an associate professor of history and the inaugural Baker Chair in the History of Science, Technology, and Innovation. Professor Campos is currently Baruch S. Bloomberg NASA Library of Congress Chair in Astrobiology and Senior Fellow at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Center for Health Policy. He is the author of Radium and the Secret of Life, co-editor of Making Mutations, Objects, Practices, Contexts, and Nature Remade, which has recently come out from the University of Chicago Press, Nature Remade, Engineering Life, Envisioning Worlds. I'm grateful to have these great minds in conversation. So a final word. The event was inspired by conversations I've had with students in Environmental Studies 100, our core class in the major, over the last few years. And it is, I have to say, the most diverse mix of disciplines I've ever taught in one classroom. At last count, it was something like 28 different minors and programs and majors, and I can't even quite keep track. As we've discussed over the years, planetary problems, solutions, and futures, my students, I've noticed, often swing between two extremes, for which I have a lot of sympathy. The first might be described as, we'll fix it. We'll invent our way out of where we are now and mend what's broken. The second might be described as, haven't we done enough? Shouldn't we stop interfering with living systems and with the planet more generally? These students are very much not alone in this oscillation. It's a moment we're in grappling with the incredible impact, the human imprint on planetary life, from the microcosmic of genetics to the macrocosm of the geological record. Many wonder, what now? What technologies and practices might or even must be deployed given the severity of challenges arising, which must be consigned to the dustbin of history because they're simply too damaging. If neither will fix it nor will leave it all alone is sufficient, what are the best ways forward? I'm especially drawn to the perspectives our guests bring to the subject and the help they offer in escaping these futile binaries. Holly Buck encourages us to think after geoengineering, to see it not as a monolith to be celebrated or rejected, but as a specific set of practices, projects, and social interventions occurring over decades and even over centuries, and whose utility must be understood in those timescales as we consider possible planetary futures. Christopher Preston conceives of a synthetic nature and of our moment not as the Anthropocene, but as a Plastocene, so as to focus on the complex malleability of this planetary moment, a malleability we very well may need as much as we worry about. And finally, Luis Campos counsels an understanding of the complex histories out of which technologies emerge and the social and political systems they construct, often without our noticing, especially with respect to efforts to remake living systems at the genetic level. And this week, after to me and to many, disappointing COP26 in Glasgow, I am especially grateful for the wisdom our guests will share. So let me turn it over now to Professor Holly G. Buck.
Hi, it's such a pleasure to be here in such excellent company. I'm going to tell you a little bit about two books. So it sounds like one of these books is about remaking nature and the other one isn't. You may look at these titles and think that they are about two completely different things because, you know, the one, it has the word geoengineering, that book. It looks at both methods for removing carbon from the atmosphere at a large scale, as well as solar geoengineering, so techniques that reflect some amount of incoming sunlight to cool the planet. And argues that we need to be researching these things, but how we go about it really matters. And then on the other hand, this book about ending fossil fuels, Why Net Zero is Not Enough. The title almost says it all, but it's really kind of about why we need to phase out fossil fuels. You know, finally, we have a mention of them in an international treaty for the first time. It's taken, what, like 27 years to get there. But how we can look at the challenges of that and what sort of policies we should have on the table to enact that phase out. Really, however, both of these books are about remaking nature. and engineered worlds. And so I'll talk about why for the next few minutes. So regular net zero relies on remaking nature and developing tools by which to know and manage nature. Net zero is basically having some amount of positive emissions or residual emissions that are balanced by negative emissions. And so this is one kind of scenario from the same set of scenarios that are used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And this is to keep warming well below 2 degrees Celsius. You can see that where we are now with where have this 35, maybe 40, a lot of gigatons, billions of tons of CO2 going into the atmosphere, more if you include other greenhouse gases. And the imagination is that there's some amount of residual emissions in this, modeling by the end of century, less than 5 gigatons from transportation. So that's like aviation and shipping mainly, but a few other sectors. And you can see below the zero line, that's negative emissions. That's building out large infrastructures that would remove carbon from the atmosphere, 10 billion tons a year by the end of century. And you can see many of these sorts of graphs, but they all tell the same story, which has become so familiar that at this point you can buy like a hoodie with the figure 10 gigatons, right? Because that's the amount that would need to be removed from the atmosphere according to this sort of modeling. And so the energy transition is a kind of terraforming already. I'm not sure it's well appreciated. It involves designing the world to a degree. And I encourage everybody to read this report, Net Zero America, by a group of scholars out of Princeton University. It's a fascinating read. It uses several different scenarios to look at how the US can get to net zero by 2050. This image is from kind of the most renewables intensive scenario, so doesn't rely very much on biofuels or carbon capture and storage. Really large amounts of land are devoted to wind and solar, both. So the orange is solar projects, the blue is wind, including offshore across the whole Atlantic coast. I mean, this is going to be a major infrastructural build out. And even if we don't go for this extremely renewable scenario, the other scenarios are similarly intensive in terms of building carbon capture and storage infrastructure or devoting land to biofuels, et cetera. So major changes in land use, infrastructure, electrifying everything, reforming how we farm using different methods and technologies, changing our relationship to the oceans, either with aquaculture or offshore wind or deep sea mining for some of the renewables. the renewable infrastructure is actually pretty energy materials intensive in terms of batteries and all sorts of things. So there's a major mining project behind renewables. I mean, maybe all of this is obvious, but the point I'm trying to draw is that even this net zero relies on a remaking of nature and of our relationship to nature, thinking of the oceans not as wild spaces, but cultivated spaces, managed spaces. And somehow we're already there in kind of the business discourse, but I'm not sure the popular discourse is caught up to that. And then also thinking about, managing the global carbon cycle. We can see kind of a snapshot of it now, but thinking about maybe not 10 gigatons of removals, maybe 5 or maybe 2, those are still big projects, including the phase out of fossil fuels. So changing that intentionally is another form of steering and engineering and management. And there's some schematics. These are both from research institutes based in the Middle East, where companies like Aramco are investing in this circular carbon framework. So really managing fossil fuels in a way that can capture their emissions, decarbonize them to some degree. You can read these frameworks about circular carbon as idealistic or duplicitous. I don't know. Both of those would be fair readings, but it's a mindset that involves a lot of management of these cycles. Then also thinking about, okay, if you don't want to keep extracting and managing, what about moving to bioplastics, replacing petrochemicals with biomaterials? There's innovation that could happen in that space that would be a different sort of vision of how to remake nature and live in this kind of engineered future. And, you know, a post-extractivist version. But what I want to draw attention to is that it's changes in computing that will enable all of these futures and more. There's a huge information architecture that's implied by net zero, because it implies that you can know the positive emissions, you know, so new tools like satellites that can sense emissions, for example, like the visualization on the bottom of this slide, but that you can track those throughout the supply chain around the world. Then imagining that you can know where the carbon is going if you're removing the carbon, that's a whole other monitoring challenge. It's a technical challenge and also a governance challenge in terms of, you know, avoiding corruption and fraud and so forth. And then imagining an information architecture that's matching up these emissions and removals and exchanging them between countries or companies. That's something that exists to some degree in the current carbon markets, but net zero implies a, you know, expansion of all of that. And so we're building those sorts of tools. Information technology is at the root of remaking nature. So coming back to these two books, you know, the question I put forth is why one set of interventions is considered geoengineering and the other isn't. I know we've, in the community that thinks about these things, we've kind of talked to death the definitional issues around these terms. But from a remaking nature standpoint, the projects here are actually of a similar scale and have some interesting overlaps that could be fruitful to discuss. So thank you so much. I look forward to our conversation.
So first I wanted to apologize to everybody for the lighting. I'm in a borrowed office space and it's either spotlight from this side or big fluorescence from above, and I think this is maybe the better, but I know it's not ideal, so I apologize for that. I do environmental ethics, and what is environmental ethics? Environmental ethics is looking at the relationships between humans and animals and between humans and the surrounding world. Now, within environmental ethics, I've been working on the ethics of emerging technology. So what is that? That is asking what new technologies are going to do to those relationships between humans and animals and humans and the rest of the non-human world and environment. So I'm very happy that I got invited to join you all on this panel on remaking nature, because it's really right up my alley in terms of my disciplines. It's very topical and something I've been thinking about for a while now. But I haven't been using the phrase remaking nature, and in a little bit I'll tell you what I have been using as a phrase. But really what I've been thinking about working on is very much on tonight's topic. So let me start with this claim: we live in interesting times. Let me now ratchet that claim up a bit and say we live in unique times, historically unique times. Now, I know when you're on a panel with historians that you really are going out on a limb when you suggest you live in unique times, and I think I might be called out on that in a little while, but I'm going to assert that we live in unique times. And why is it that I think that? It's because of the technologies that are coming on tap right now. So the technologies that I'm talking about, and I've forgotten, oh yeah, there you go. The technologies I'm talking about range through a whole gamut of scales, from the atom all the way up to the atmosphere. And those technologies start with nanotechnology, which is the reworking of molecular arrangements and atomic arrangements to create new properties, through the various biotechnologies, all the way up to climate engineering, which Dr. Buck was just talking about. And in my work, I found that a lot of these technologies were all sort of coming into prime time at about the same period, round about now. And so you can lump them all together in this string from atom to atmosphere. And you can say that what these technologies do is they create for us synthetic age. So instead of saying remaking nature, I say we're entering a synthetic age. And sometimes I also call that the Plastocene, but the synthetic age is the term I use more often, and it ended up in this book, The Synthetic Age. Now, why do I think this time is unique? It's because of the completeness, the scope of these technologies, and the quality of the technologies, the type of things that they do. So let me be a little more specific about what I mean by that. Obviously, we've had technologies before that have been global. I mean, in some respects, you might think the combustion engine is a global technology because of its impact on the climate. But thinking of the combustion engine as a technology of the synthetic age would be wrong, because it doesn't affect the climate deliberately. It doesn't make a change intentionally. So being deliberate is an important quality of a technology of the synthetic age. The second important quality of a technology of the synthetic age is that the technology really gets into the Earth's metabolism. And what that means is it doesn't just get in to affect how the Earth looks. It doesn't just change things on the surface. It changes how the Earth works. It gets in under the skin, gets into the metabolism, and changes the way various features of the Earth actually work. And I want to illustrate that with a couple of examples. So I'm going to talk about synthetic organisms, climate engineering, and gene drives. So synthetic organisms, the idea there is putting together nucleotides in a certain sequence designed on a computer, and then putting them into a bacterium and having them take over the operation of that bacterium. So you have a wholly synthetic genome running a bacterial organism. Now, why is that a synthetic age type of technology? Because by designing that DNA on a computer, you bypass those formative processes that were previously responsible for creating what organisms look like. So you get in under the surface of the Earth, you get beneath the skin, and you change how the world works by changing those processes that create organisms. What does climate engineering do? And I'm talking specifically here about the stratospheric aerosol version of climate engineering, where you are shading out incoming heat. What climate engineering would do is it would calibrate the amount of shortwave radiation that reaches the Earth from the sun. So you're redesigning a fundamental feature of how the Earth works, a feature that's responsible for all of life through all of history. And you're redesigning it according to human intent and human need. So climate engineering, it's metabolic, it's deliberate, so it's a technology of the synthetic age. Gene drives are ways of sending traits through wild populations of organisms. So you design a little packet, a genetic packet, you put it in a germ cell, it copies itself in that germ cell, and so it biases inheritance. And then as that organism breeds, the trait that you've chosen spreads through a population. So that's also a metabolic type of technology, because the technology bends the rules of Mendelian inheritance in order to create the world that you wish to see. So we're entering this synthetic age. And I said earlier on that I am an ethicist. And so what is an ethicist likely to say about these sorts of technologies? And you know, that's kind of what I do, is I say things about these sorts of technologies. Let me be clear about one thing first. Here's what an ethicist does not do. An ethicist does not look at technologies like these and say, well, that one's okay, that one's not okay. The ethicist doesn't have an algorithm for coming up with suitable answers to the right or wrong of a particular technology. In fact, it turns out that this list of technologies from atom to atmosphere, I think it's very contextual as to when and how and in what ways they're appropriate. So I don't actually think you can make any general claim about that list of technologies that I had up there. on one of those earlier slides. But one thing I think an ethicist can do is they can look at what we're saying about technologies like these. And an ethicist can say, is the discussion broad enough? Is the discussion including enough relevant considerations before we make a decision about these technologies? And I want to just illustrate for you finally here the source of considerations that one might have when one was weighing whether to proceed with a synthetic organism or weighing whether to proceed with climate engineering. Probably first and foremost, the ethical consideration that would come to mind would be to ask whether you get the benefits you're intending without too great a harm. And that's a legitimate first place to start. It lands very high on the scale of the things that are ethically important. But I would suggest that it's by far not the only consideration that these sorts of technologies should have. Let me add a couple more. The second important consideration in all of these cases is whether the technology can be deployed justly, or whether it contributes to an injustice or perpetuates an injustice that's been going on for a period of time. So this steps away from the question of, all right, well, you know, does the technology actually do what it says it'll do? And it asks, what's the social context in which this technology is operating? And does this social context get pushed by the technology in a way that is undesirable? Now, let me add the third piece here. And this is the piece really that gives my book its title, The Synthetic Age. Are there distinctive reasons that you might hesitate with some of these technologies, which are not to do with benefits and harms, not to do with questions of justice, but to do with the change in relationship with the surrounding world? And so in this case, what one would be asking is, one would be saying, is the creation of a synthetic age, if there is such a thing, is the entering into that kind of synthetic world, is that a desirable new relationship that humans should have with what lays around them? And this third one, I think, is a question that is easy to miss when one is considering emerging technologies and when one's thinking about remaking the Earth. But I think it's an important one and needs to be in the conversation. So that's what I have for now. And I'll stop the share.
It's Professor Campos, please.
Are the slides coming through then? Great. So thank you for that very kind introduction. I am so looking forward to meeting many of you in person on campus and in the classroom next year, and to making Rice my new home. So I wanted to talk a little bit about our planetary home for a bit. It has been rough going recently. Across the West this past summer, of course, smoke from wildfires impacted our ability not only to see, but also to breathe on a continental scale. The last time my professional association of historians of science was able to meet, in 2019, the second day of the conference broke the all-time record for extreme heat. The third day of the conference saw the record broken yet again. 6 months after that, I happened to be in southern Chile, where there was a heat wave in the region, which also turned out to be the hottest day in Antarctic history. And this past summer, I was in Germany when Europe reached its hottest day in recorded history. So I don't know what this says about me, but it does raise the question of, what does it mean to have a habitable world, a world in which we can live? And I bring up these terrifying examples because when we talk about remaking nature, about bioengineering and geoengineering, we're talking about possible ways to make our Earth more habitable for us. And this idea of habitability has a very deep history. It sometimes seems as if we are in a new and cataclysmic period that we call the Anthropocene or the Plasticine or other sorts of terms we might use. We often debate its origin in 1492, in the Industrial Revolution, or with the explosion of the first atomic bomb in 1945. Lots of folks in the atomic age wondered for just how much longer the Earth would remain habitable. They were concerned about ionizing radiation from nuclear testing or a possible nuclear war, and even the idea of climate change caused by nuclear winter. But this atomic age concept of habitability also became a central driving force for NASA. At first, in figuring out how to help astronauts survive in space, what would it take? And later transforming into a question of whether there might be other forms of life out there on some Goldilocks planet in the habitable zone of a medium-sized star where water could exist, a place like home. So NASA's search for other habitable worlds actually emerged out of a Cold War context with the implicit question of whether we humans could live somewhere else if we needed to. It's as if the mindset was, if you mess things up enough, your only option may be to move somewhere else. And that you might be able to find a new world just like your old one, or colonize or terraform it into shape, and we've heard that story before. So as a historian, I amble through time like astronauts jet through space, and I sometimes find it helpful to juxtapose different moments and stories to see what it brings to light about things that matter to us. And that's what I'm trying to do in a history of habitability that I'm working on right now, which surprisingly ties together dimensions of both bioengineering and geoengineering. And in the course of kind of looking for a deeper history, I discovered that habitability is literally ancient history. Today, we're worried about climate change, for instance, but for the ancient Greeks, climatic zones were stable and well defined, and they lived in the temperate zone, halfway between the frigid cold and the torrid heat, two zones in which humans allegedly could not live. And they told stories about faraway peoples who found ways to adapt and make the torrid zone their home, people who used their feet as shields against the sun. So, thinking of faraway peoples whose feet stood against ours, the Antipodeans, that's where that name comes from, or which were opposite to ours in other confused ways, was part of understanding what it meant to live in an inhabited world, a world that could be inhabited. And these questions that the Greeks had about peoples who lived near the equator or nearer towards India in the east were circulated and transformed by later medieval Arabs, by European Christians, by others, and even came to frame some European understandings of the New World. It even affected early ideas about possible life in the heavens. When the early modern astronomer Johannes Kepler wrote a science fiction novel about the beings that might live on the moon, and this is not the only science fiction novel you'll hear me talk about today, when he wrote about their modes of life, their habits, and how they geoengineered their environments, he says he was inspired to do so by his reading of a book on the natural history of the Indies, written by a Jesuit priest living in Peru, who reported on the climatic and cultural conditions of the New World, and who said that the ancients didn't know what they were talking about because Peru was on the equator and it was cold even when the sun was high up overhead. So today we might be asking whether there are new Earths in the heavens, but these questions about environments and habitability, the life we might find in various places or what might be possible, were from the very start framed by considerations of what it meant and means to live in old and new worlds here on Earth. So what I find so cool about this little story that I've just kind of stumbled across in the last few months is that it suggests a deep, deep history of bio and geoengineering that we each must engage with. For example, with the history of European colonization in the New World, that this isn't a separate or a separable story, but an intertwined one. And that before it's called bioengineering or terraforming, it's called colonization, economic expansion, agriculture, slavery. Using those words reminds us of what can be at stake in speculative visions for exciting engineerable futures. And considerations of what makes a place habitable or desirable to be inhabited and for whom ties in not only with how we might engineer better environments for ourselves, but has always been intertwined with questions of other people, with what it means to be human, and with who gets to make claims on knowledge, on land, or on the environment. That context matters. So, although these resonances between science and its larger social context, whether we're talking about new worlds on Earth or new worlds in the heavens, these connections may seem more visible in the past, they're just as operative in our contemporary moment if we know how to look. What does it mean that at the exact moment that NASA is locating thousands upon thousands of exoplanets, a good number of which are believed to be habitable, that masses of environmentalists and concerned citizens at climate change marches are protesting that there is no planet B, or that Mars is not an option? And there is this remarkable juxtaposition on the front page of the New York Times On the day of the announcement of the TRAPPIST-1 system in 2017, a system with 7 Earth-sized planets, 3 of which exist in the habitable zone and may have water, how could we write this history of habitability in a way that takes seriously this juxtaposition of a story about second Earths, with its implicit promise of second chances, with the story immediately beneath the picture about migration here on Earth? It raises questions about what it means to make a home on this planet. Colonists, settlers, migrants. What might it mean for writing the history of the inhabited world to be as attentive to these cultural contexts? It suggests, I think, that in what sometimes feels like the trash heap of our current circumstances in the Anthropocene, an increasingly uninhabitable and inhospitable world, that another world may be possible. We can take this contextual approach to the history of bioengineering as well, an area that is near and dear to me. Many contemporary synthetic biologists today are thinking about biology as a kind of technology platform, and they marvel over possible futures for biology, where what we have is not just what nature has given us, or a total depletion of biodiversity to be fearful of, but some wonder if, with our ingenuity, we might be standing at what they describe as the edge of a new Cambrian explosion of biodiversity. These are exciting ideas. They make for cool comic books and for even the front cover of Nature. Most of biotechnology has yet to be imagined, let alone made true, says one of these prominent synthetic biologists. What might it be like, he asked, if we were able to re-implement life in a manner of our own choosing? What if we moved beyond the attributes that we inherited, he said, from the continent of natural lineages? You can imagine arriving on a new continent, he said, where we're totally unconstrained by the lineages that pre-exist in nature. And instead of just imagining the world as it exists and as we inherit it from nature, he said, I think it's becoming increasingly important that we understand how to imagine worlds that might be, how we would choose to design and construct them. These pronouncements from synthetic biologists in recent years are promissory, they're optimistic, they're forward-looking framings of the engineering of life. In the 1970s, when classical genetic engineering first emerged, there were often more expressions of concern about unknown impacts and possibilities, even by many practicing scientists themselves. The phrase genetic engineering sounded like a problematic term for eugenics to many. And the idea of genetically engineered organisms potentially escaping from the laboratory sounded a lot like popular best-selling science fiction thrillers, like one that had just come out by Michael Crichton called The Andromeda Strain, which was about a pandemic caused by germs from space. And within a few years, this novel would be repeatedly invoked, intruding into important biology conferences, talking about laboratory biocontainment protocols for recombinant DNA, and even into conversations among lawmakers on Capitol Hill about what would be appropriate policies to have for a future of newly engineered organisms. I've been busy putting the finishing touches on an essay in the edited volume that just came out this past summer, where I look at the story about how the Andromeda Strain played a central role in these visions of what the future of life might be during this time period of the emergence of genetic engineering in the 1970s. I was exploring the ways in which science fiction novels like this actually could affect the science and the policy. And as I was reading about these new directives that were envisioned, requiring that some recombinant DNA research be done in specially equipped and ventilated laboratories while wearing special personal protective equipment, I suddenly found myself breathing for the first time in my life through an N95 mask for 20 hours as I flew back across the Atlantic to come home. This was just a day after March 13th of 2020 when the world had changed, and I had found myself avoiding a highly contagious and potentially deadly infectious agent that had arrived seemingly from nowhere, just like in the Andromeda Strain that I had been writing about, and which was responsible for a worldwide pandemic. And no matter where I went, the world turned out not to be a very habitable sort of place. And I would read in the New York Times a passage like this: what could be more bone-chilling than a seemingly out-of-control virus leaping from region to region around the globe without a known vaccine to prevent it or slow it down, causing death and economic mayhem along the way? That the coronavirus narrative has the texture and feel of the Andromeda Strain, the 1969 scientific thriller, come to life. And of course, we then rapidly produced a vaccine, right, at Operation Warp Speed, another science fiction invention, right? So this suggests that the sorts of promises and perils and the discourses of how we talk about, envision, describe, and mobilize these new kinds of engineerings are always existing in complex cultural and political worlds, and sometimes with deep histories that we're not even aware of. And so this is why I think that time travel, by which I mean history, can be so helpful for illuminating some interesting questions that we are always facing in whatever current moment we're in, whether we're talking about bioengineering or whether we're talking about geoengineering. And sometimes, as in the atomic age, when we had a great deal of concerns about the effects of an increasingly radioactive world and the effects of radiation on human heredity, these questions about the futures of humanity and of the planet were not entirely separable, right? Bio and geoengineering were not really separable categories in that way. And this all suggests that in understanding how we might modify ourselves or our planet, that things, of course, can be new and cutting edge. They can be unique. So I will permit you that, Christopher, no problem at all. But there's also a way in which things recur in surprising ways over longer periods of time. The novelist who once described about history burping. So it's not quite the same, but it's resonant with something that came before. That the cases we might look and think with can be quite different. They often might have quite different moral valences at different moments in time. We can think of the Cuyahoga River, which caught on fire many times until it finally then became a symbol for a river that needed to be cleaned up rather than a place that was advancing with industry, right? Deforestation also has this similar shift in valence that's attached to it, of being something about progress to being something about ruin. So I think the trick here is the work it takes to figure out which insights from which histories matter most for us to think with. And what I also find useful about thinking with history in this way is that we learn we don't always get to choose the worlds or the narratives that we find ourselves in or using. So that's a little bit about what rocks my boat in the history of science and its relationship to bio and to geoengineering. I think scholars of the future, many of whom are doubtless tuned in today, will have a lot to think about in analyzing these relations here. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what our conversation tonight is going to be like. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Those were fantastic presentations. And Professor Petrick and I will launch into some questions. I want to remind everyone in the audience of two things quickly. One, you can post your questions in the Q&A function. And second, those of you who are attending the Classroom Connect afterward, stay with us throughout this. Don't worry, they won't start without you. Okay, I want to launch in first with a question about speculation. And I was so hoping, Luis, you were going to talk about science fiction tonight. So, and maybe what I want to ask is for all of our guests, I'm thinking about this interesting oscillation between speculation, something perhaps future-oriented, and then also history. My own field is actually either described as the age of Shakespeare or the Little Ice Age, depending on your point of view, right? Sort of an earlier moment of climactic instability. And so I very much think about those things. And our students are very interested in this, right? One of our more popular classes, not surprisingly, is science fiction and the environment. So I'm thinking in all of your work about the value of speculation. Holly, I love in your book the way that you construct those alternate timelines in the introduction. Louise, you just sort of talked about the Andromeda Strain and sort of the fascination of playing out, simulating sort of future-oriented scenarios from different moments of history. And Christopher, as I was thinking about the synthetic age, it seems to be both something that was that perhaps was predicted decades ago in science fiction, but also that seems very much a kind of future-oriented moment right now that has to do with a certain kind of unique moment of technology in 2021, right? Looking forward. So I guess I want to ask maybe all three of you about the value of speculation. It seems to be something that we keep coming back to through science fiction, through science, through sort of all sorts of writing about the environment now, but it also seems to be a kind of point of resistance, as in, let's stop speculating and actually start acting, right? So, which is something I heard a lot around the beginning of the COP26 conference as it opened. So I'd love to hear the three of you, anyone who wants, speak about speculation.
Jump in right away then. So one of the things that I thought was so interesting about that moment of the 1970s when genetic engineering is first emerging and recombinant DNA technologies are the new thing here, and at this book having this effect on these conversations, was the ways in which what got counted as an appropriate concern for what might happen was described in one sort of way, whereas irresponsible speculation, that was sensationalism, was a different sort of of framing. And it really determined, it was affected by who made the claim and who was seen to be a responsible actor, bringing forward items that needed to be addressed within a scientific community, and who was seen to be having other interests at stake, like selling newspapers. And so there's a very clean sort of identification that we can look at, that what counts as responsible or irresponsible speculation is in the eye of the beholder, and that agonistic field in which people are arguing with each other about what counts as being responsible or not is part of the process of making those determinations. And to see that the same story, the same book could be used both as a reason to call a conference and to speak about how we might want to engineer a fail-safe organism, and on the other hand, why there must be federal policies that control this new technology, and that's what the federal government is for. So I think speculation as something that exists to be contested is one thing I saw in that moment in the 70s.
I might add that for me, speculation is very valuable, and that, I was working with kind of these graphs and these scenarios from climate modeling and integrated assessment modeling that weren't very legible. So speculation was a tool to help these futures be more embodied, more alive, inhabited by people. And that allowed me to step away from the technologies towards the social relations that could be possible with different sorts of technologies. So I find it super valuable. I also think there's a side of speculation that maybe tends towards conspiracy. I think about particular speculations like the lab leak hypothesis with COVID, which was taboo and then was less taboo. And I haven't checked in with it lately, so I don't know where that stands now. But there's all sorts of other sorts of speculations that maybe aren't exactly in the sense that we've been talking about it in terms of science fiction, but are somehow, to me, in my mind, connected. I'll leave it there.
I want to add something less enthusiastic about speculation. In some of the worlds that I operate in, speculation has led to some really distorted ethical thinking, and the one that's coming to mind for me is Deextinction. So you lose a species like the northern white rhino, and then some visions of returning northern white rhinos using frozen sperm and southern white rhinos as incubators of northern white rhinos, sort of leads people to believe that this is a way to make good on the mistake that's been made in losing the animal in the first place. But when you look a little closer at some of these speculative de-extinctions, there's several things that aren't going to add up in the narrative. You're not going to get the northern white rhino back. You're going to get some sort of hybrid with mitochondrial DNA from elsewhere. You're not going to have the ecosystem that you had when the species left the planet. And so many people have seen recently that the woolly mammoth project about maybe 2 months ago that was announced. And I mean, what you're going to get is not even close to a woolly mammoth. It's essentially a hairy Asian elephant that would be cold adapted. So that there are cases where the ethical thinking is disrupted by projections of things that might be imaginatively attractive, but really are a long way from what's possible and what could be real.
I think that's very interesting. If I can just jump in there, that case about de-extinction and of the woolly mammoth in particular, or whatever that organism is that George Church and others have been suggesting to do, the ways in which ethics can be used as tactics is what I find very interesting. And his claim that this would somehow then help, tamp down the permafrost and keep it colder, and this could be a solution to climate change, right? Things that just sound utterly fantastical, utterly speculative, but the interest in the action is being justified on what are ethical claims. At least that's how it's being put out there. So on the one hand, you are the professional ethicist. I defer to you on that, but I'm interested as the historian seeing how these ethical claims seem to operate as a kind of tactical move by some of these speculative practitioners talking about bio or geoengineering today.
And if, just to add, if the idea of getting a woolly mammoth back is far-fetched, the idea of getting a sort of functioning step that would perform these climatic benefits for us is several steps beyond the stretch that the woolly mammoth is.
And Holly, there was something that you said that I thought was very interesting. If I can just ask you to say a little bit more about it, but you said, why one set of things is called geoengineering and the other isn't. I think that's a really interesting point of what gets chosen to be framed in one way or another and how that draws attention or doesn't draw attention. I just wanted to know if you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, well, Christopher's talk was actually really helpful in that kind of defining the synthetic age as deliberately reworking Earth's metabolism. So I was trying to think about whether the two things I spoke about, climate engineering and envisioning a net zero future, both fall into that. And I think that maybe you could argue it either way. But I've always felt like there's a sort of aesthetic sense about what's considered geoengineering and kind of a glossing over some of the ways in which moving to a fully renewable world is also a major engineering project, because I think it's pretty clear why we think about renewables the way that we do, why that construction exists. Looking at the historical roots, you probably know more about it than I do, but a feeling of small scale, decentralized, that was projected onto renewables, even though it's manifesting in all sorts of ways. That's one of them, but it's also, mega scale engineering too. Yeah, that's what I had in mind.
All right, I'm going to jump in here. I have a question for you all that was submitted by one of our participants in advance, and this comes from John Eldridge. He asks, what about Amitav Ghosh's view that our climate crisis stems from seeing nature as a resource to exploit? Do any of you have any comments on that?
I agree with that. And I think it's not just nature, but also other people. And those are working together, unfortunately.
I definitely find myself wanting to agree with it, but the question that comes immediately behind that one is, well, what other ethical attitude would stop the climate crisis? And the climate crisis is so tied into technological practices that as an ethicist, I'm skeptical that there will be a different ethical attitude that could actually rein in the climate crisis without the practices and the technologies changing first. So I'm sympathetic with the direction of the question, but I'm unsure what the sort of follow-up solution after the question is.
And I think what I find in resonating with that question is that for many times, many places, many contexts, there was a sense of a duty, maybe even a God-given duty, to improve the world and to treat nature in that way and to make it fruitful and transform the landscape. So something that might sound very challenging or difficult, or how do we rethink how we interact with the world today, might have had a completely different valence in an earlier moment in time. And I think thinking of it in that deeper history helps to get us to realize that sometimes things that we do with the best of intentions, with the best of hopes and means at our disposal, might be viewed rather harshly by folks who come along later at a different moment in time who wonder how we ever could have done that. And I think that sort of framing from that sort of deeper historical approach could help us think a great deal about, for instance, longer term, permanent, large scale geoengineering approaches?
I can follow up because I think this is a really important question because it isn't easy to answer. It seems like it has an easy answer, right? But ultimately doesn't. I'm thinking, Christopher, about something you write in the Synthetic Age about the state we are in now, and sort of just to quote a little bit of it, nature might paradoxically need considerable human manipulation in order to survive as nature in the new epoch. And I'm thinking about that because it feels painfully true, but or worryingly right, sort of that it hits you with a kind of great deal of worry. But I also think about the origins of certain ideas of kind of the environment concept, right, which becomes a kind of important master concept mid 20th century, which is a kind of managerial understanding of nature. And I guess maybe I'm not sure how to pose this exactly as a question, other than to say I think it's easy to see the downsides of a kind of managerial approach. And on the other hand, it does seem to be we're left with it does seem to raise the question of what other sorts of solutions are there. Are we sense being is the sort of cure worse than the disease? I mean, it seems to be a kind of tension around that seems a little hard to kind of see past right now. I think it's some of why might even explain why there is so much speculation. As if can we just speed out of this moment into something that's a future that seems to be moving in a direction. But I wonder too that kind of managerialness, that sort of managerial approach, it might have some kind of complications and limits too.
Yeah, it's funny you should mention that because I'm been working more recently on issues of rewilding. And at first you sort of think, well, wait, I thought you were interested in technology. Why are you writing about rewilding and bringing animals back? But to me, it actually follows very closely behind a book on technology, because the technology book addresses implicitly the question of wildness and whether these technologies can be managed in such a way that they eliminate wildness and unpredictability. And I think in many cases the answer is no. And also, if you're going to look at wildness in the synthetic age, you have to ask, why is it that at the same time that a lot of these technologies are coming on stream, there are massive movements towards rewilding in many parts of the world, especially in Europe, and that's actually the motivation for me being here right now. And so these efforts at rewilding seem to be sort of pushing back against the synthetic age, but some of the rewilding is really quite managerial. It's not all let's hang back and wait for the wolves to arrive. In some cases it's captive breeding, releasing animals, sometimes then bringing them back into captivity and treating them. For example, California condors have to get treated with chelating agents to get the lead out of their blood. So this is not really sort of the wild coming back in its full wildness. It's a managed return of the wild. And so, I think you're right that the sort of managerial period we're entering in, it has different valences to it. Some of it is very sort of engineering focused, deterministic, and physicalistic. And some of it is actually a little more spontaneous and more biological, and perhaps has an endpoint that's less predictable.
I think there's also an interesting kind of tension there between a preservation sort of motive and the advancement of a management technique that might make it possible to do what could be needed, even if that's not the same as preserving what is still there. So having subspecies that breed with other species that are near them, or artificial places for creating wild spaces that really could not have been wild spaces before. I think of the Oostvaardersplassen in the Netherlands, this place that had been below water that is then drained, turned into land, and then made into this kind of example of a rewilded space for something that could never have had those animals that exist there. And so I think there's an interesting question when we talk about management. We have older language of caretaker or of stewardship or of dominion. We have this kind of business language that emerges then in the 20th century. I think of Julian Huxley talking about how we need to be in the role of the business manager for the cosmic process of evolution. And that's not just preservationist, that's kind of, that's engineering. That's how can we take life to new possibilities and new prospects. So there is some kind of very interesting, there's many meanings, I think, that are enfolded in that idea of management.
Also occurs to me to say quickly, and this might be something Holly has something to say about, which is that you're both raising also the question of where do accidents come into it? And an accident can be very good. It can be, provocative thing no one saw coming, whether we're talking about biology or geology, or it could be something devastating, right? As in the unintended consequence of certain kind of ideas, certain geoengineering projects. And I wonder how, given your different researches, you think about that role of sort of the unexpected or the accidental.
I mean, for me, I think, you weigh it against not doing anything and the consequences of that, or failing to intervene and what that means. And just to link it back to the last conversation, I mean, I titled my book after geoengineering because I wanted to imagine things that geoengineering could be a bridge to. And in particular, I think one of the underexplored rationales for potentially doing solar geoengineering, if we had enough research to indicate that it might work in the way that modelers hope, is the possibility of having less species go extinct. So could solar geoengineering be a bridge to a future where there is more rewilding in whatever sense, where there's return of land to indigenous peoples who have systems for tending it? I mean, can you picture a technological intervention like solar geoengineering enabling some of these futures because the species are still alive? So that was my thought, in between those two things. Would there be a risk? Of course, there would be, unexpected things that come with solar geoengineering, as in everything. Are those worth it? We don't have enough information right now to say one way or another, in my view.
Picking up on what you just said there, Holly, I had a conversation once with an esteemed environmental ethicist, and it was about solar geoengineering. And I was saying, I was sort of banging my synthetic age drum, and I was saying, this is creating an artifact Earth, and this is turning sort of nature into something artificial. And they replied, well, no, it's not. It's protecting nature. It's putting a sunscreen or sunshade up in the stratosphere in order to let nature carry on being what it is. And I was shocked at how we had come at it from completely opposite directions. It probably hadn't occurred to him to think of it the way I was thinking, and it certainly hadn't occurred to me to think of it the way he was thinking.
We have a couple of questions in the Q&A that I think speak to a lot of what you all have been talking about. They concern the limits or bounds of engineering and human intervention. So I'm going to read both of them, and you can kind of pick and choose how you'd like to respond. The first is, I've been interested lately in the 19th century exhortation that the rain will follow the plow. The idea that turning prairie into farmland was virtuous and would be rewarded with more moderate climate conditions. Would the panelists consider this an early attempt at geoengineering? So what are the kind of limits of geoengineering historically in human intervention? And the second question is, how do population control strategies fit in with engineering solutions?
I guess on the first point, I wouldn't necessarily considering it geoengineering, just because the traditional, traditional as in 10 or 15 or 20 years old definition of geoengineering is something that's both intentional and planetary in scale, and that would be intentional, but perhaps not planetary. However, it would be possibly a form of weather modification or climate modification. On the second question, I mean, I think that population control is a sort of technology. It definitely leans on various technologies. I think that has been to this point a kind of a trade-off where if you look at some of the modeling papers on how to reach temperature targets, there are all these modeling studies that said, well, we need to remove this much carbon and do all these things. And those were greeted by a few papers that said, okay, we're going to model demand side reductions. We're going to model things that don't involve all these huge technological infrastructures. And some of those studies rely on assumptions about a lower population than we have today without spelling out, how we're going to get there. So I think for some people, the idea of controlling or reducing populations is like the other option besides, doing technology.
Just quickly to that, the first question about rain following the plow, but when the discussion of geoengineering first really took off in around 2010, historian James Fleming wrote a book, Fixing the Sky, and he put today's geoengineering discussion on a continuum with all sorts of different weather modification types of practices. So definitely that's in the same vein. But I think Dr. Buck is right about it can't really fit the strict definition because it's not planetary. It's not geoengineering.
That raises an interesting question of scale being such an important feature here, right? At a level of a state is quite different than the level of a continent, and that's quite different than the level of the world itself. But I'm kind of struck by a moment I remember from Thomas Jefferson when he had been talking about the conditioning of the American climate and how in such a short period of time the climate had changed because of clearing the forests and draining marshes and things like this. And that was a way of showing that the US was advancing and progressing to be more like Europe. And he had an idea that came from Benjamin Franklin's studies of the Gulf Stream, that you could really kind of radically transform the climate of the eastern half of the North American continent by basically opening a passageway across Panama, and that this would somehow disrupt the Gulf Stream. Ships wouldn't have to fight so hard to go west. You wouldn't have fogs in Newfoundland. So is that geoengineering or not? It's a continental scale sort of vision, a thought of desired sort of vision for how human intervention on a large regional scale could make rather significant differences in what it would mean to live in the eastern half of the United States, or what was the United States at the time. So I agree it's not on the scale of the planet, but I think it's very interesting to see how even in a very short period of time, like 200 years, the ways in which we think about those sorts of endeavors can change quite drastically.
One last question, because I know many have places to go, though I have sort of a dozen questions I'd love to ask. So I'm going to apologize in advance to my guests if I email them after this. But I want to ask a last question, something that actually Liz and I were talking about. We both teach in fields where we have students, and as I said earlier, in ENST 127 different majors. I've never taught courses like that. All three of you identify with a particular discipline, and at the same time work incredibly across them to be able to write about the things that you do. So maybe you could close with any words you have about your point of view working across disciplines on the kinds of problems that you address in your work.
I'll jump in quickly that this work has been some of the most exciting of my career because I find myself in conversations with all sorts of interesting people that I simply never would have encountered before. And one also has to sort of develop I think a certain sort of nimbleness to hop between languages, identify different priorities that people in different disciplines have, and to sort of learn to sort of see the pulse of a discussion, which moves depending on which discipline that the person leading the conversation is in. And I find this terribly exciting, terribly interesting, and rewarding. And so I've really enjoyed the science, technology, and engineering elements of what I've done in the last few years.
I think it's really exciting and also very difficult at the same time. And being able to find common language is kind of an ongoing task across disciplines, and even what counts as an interesting question. So absolutely, being nimble is part of it. I think following what one finds interesting is also a really important research tool. We don't often, I think, focus on that enough. But you know, when you use a word in your own discipline that means something so clear, that has one meaning to you, like contingency in history, and you discover that another discipline, when you say the word contingency, they think of emergency plans for something. And you realize you've had a 10-minute conversation where you didn't quite, you weren't on the same page. That shows the sort of struggles of interdisciplinarity. But the issues that we're facing are ones that can't be solved by one discipline. And so making those sorts of connections, doing that hard work is absolutely essential. And it's fun.
I agree. I've never felt actually a drive to be in any sort of discipline. And I hope I can continue to operate in a space without one. I'm sure there's a lot of value to them. And I really love conversations with people who are versed in history and engineering and all these things. But like was just mentioned, I think that these challenges really require a different sort of thinking as well. And so I'm interested in, you know, what sort of post-disciplinary space can not just combine knowledges, but produce something new. And I think topics like these are particularly fruitful for that.
Okay, we are alas out of time. There's so many more questions I have. As I said, I want to thank my colleague Liz Petrick for being here. I want to thank our excellent guests, Christopher Preston, Luis Campos, Holly Jean Buck, for their fantastic work. Also to say, I posted links to their work in the chat. If you want a little syllabus on how to think about these questions right now, that's a really great start, and it certainly has been for me. I want to just say a quick word about two events before saying goodnight. First, this Wednesday, a webinar that our colleagues in the Center for African and African American Studies are putting on November 17th at 12 p.m., Education Spillovers, Evidence from Colonial Schools in Benin, and you'll find a link in the chat. And then we'll have a fantastic conference at the end of this week, November 19th and 20th, Friday and Saturday, in the Paths of Disaster, the Moody Center for the Arts, put on in part by the Center for Environmental Studies, but primarily by our colleagues in MCLC. Luis Duno-Gutberg and Jacqueline Couty join us for great conversations about the environment and panels on Saturday about with local environmental advocates. Thanks all very much and have a wonderful night.